Hey
Hi.
there.
Hello.
Hello. So I'm really excited
Me
to talk
too.
about this case. I've been holding back since I watched the documentary, and I'm pretty excited about talking about this case because there's a lot of levels here
hmm
that I think, you don't initially, if you've been to India
hmm
or are from India, um, there are things in this case that I think are easily missed. Or let's say you just don't pick them up as important,
hmm
or um, you can easily assume, like, oh yeah, this is what this is. This is
Yeah.
obvious. So I thought that one of the first things I thought we should talk about. Now, I think I lived in India, and obviously you're actually an Indian,
Yes. Woohoo.
and woohoo! Um, we both resided in Mumbai.
Yes.
So, and I mean, I'm American born and bred. So
hmm
I kind of have a split understanding, but since I lived in India for so long, it's not immediately obvious. I had to start thinking about it to understand. And so one of the things I think that might be really helpful, because this case is pretty crazy, and I
Yes.
mean that in that there's a lot of complexity, and then no complexity, but we'll get into that part later. So
hmm
I thought we should talk a little bit about family structure in India.
Okay.
So, um, let's talk about a little bit about how families live. In other words, for example, I'm thinking that a lot of people do not have an understanding of the joint family structure.
Right.
I thought maybe you could help us out by talking about what that means.
Sure. I mean, it's so obvious to me that I haven't really given it a thought until I came here. But typically, you'll have um, the father's side or the man's side and their family. Everyone lives together. So let's say there's a patriarch and his wife, their kids, the kids' spouses, their children, everyone will typically stay in one house. But now they're sort of moving away from that. So you'll have like one family unit. So, like, say, one of the sons, his wife, and their kids might live separately in another household. But a joint family would be basically exactly that. The entire family lives together in one house. And it's sort of, there was a time that was frowned upon if any of the siblings wanted to split from that joint family structure and go and live separately with their wife and their kids. So I don't know if that really answers your question, but a joint family, in other words, is like the entire family on the father's side lives together, like different generations in one house. And uh, what it's moving towards now in India is like you'll have the mother, father, and the kids living in one household separately. So it's not so much as a joint family household, but a single family household.
Right. And I think that what is difficult to understand for some people is that it is not uncommon for daughters to go from one house
hmm
to the next house, meaning they leave their father's house and they
hmm
go to their husband's house. And
Yeah.
I do think that these kinds of traditional setups are important for this case because I think it can get very confusing
hmm
for someone who doesn't know how all of these families um, can interact, be in the same place, live together,
hmm
live separately, and what those things can actually mean.
Yeah.
So there is or has been a stigma if a girl moves out of a home.
Yes.
It can be considered that there's something bad about that daughter, or
hmm
that something is off.
Yeah.
She's gotten herself in trouble in some way.
hmm
So I wanted to make that clear because I think that that's something that plays into this case. It's also that in a joint family, money works a certain way, and I
Yes.
thought we'd touch upon that as well. So that because in this particular family, one of the things that I think is key to understand is that they're at a certain level of life.
Yeah.
So we'll get more into that later, but I think that it's important to understand also how money works in a joint family.
Yeah. And I think you said something really important about, again, see, I don't think of these things because I'm from the culture. And even though I've lived in the US for a while, it just, I haven't lived in a household. I live by myself. So I don't really think of these things because I don't see them as often. But like you said, the girl will marry and she'll go from her parents' house to the in law's house. The same thing works for, uh, I mean, what is similar for all kids is that all kids will stay with their parents typically until they are married. And for the girls, they'll go to the in law's house. And for the guy, typically, he'll get his wife to his parents' house.
Right. And
So,
yeah. And I just want to, before I forget, and I don't mean to interrupt you, but I know I'll forget, is that I
sure.
think that it's really important to understand that men moving out of the house is, if a son moves out of a house,
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't necessarily mean the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, in other words, that it doesn't necessarily mean that he's done something wrong or that there's something that's happened,
Yeah.
especially if it's for work.
Mm-hmm.
Now that's becoming more common for the
Yes.
girls. And, we call girls in India like girls until, they're middle aged. It goes on and on and on. So I
Yeah.
think we need to explain that too. We'll
Yeah.
probably be saying boys and girls as we have these conversations. We're really meaning males and females.
Right.
So I just want to point that out because it's a habit. Once you live there, that's how it goes.
Right.
So I think I'm sorry for interrupting, but I did not want it to seem like this is not a problem for boys. Also, there
Right.
can be a stigma
Yes.
attached.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. And like you said, we're moving away from that. And it is in some sense easier for boys because there's less attached to their image and how they're viewed in society versus for females. If they live alone, there's a certain image that's associated with that. But
Exactly.
they are now progressing where it is more accepted if you move away from your parents' home to live by yourself.
So I can imagine that somebody might ask the question, you mean they stay even if they're like 30 and unmarried,
Yeah.
35 and unmarried? The
Yep.
answer is yes.
Yes.
The answer is yes.
Yep.
And they do not want to move out. Even if they want to move out, they will
Yep.
not in many, many cases because it is a disrespect to your family. It's a dishonor to your family, potentially in
Yep.
terms of society, which is what is a very commonly heard word in Indian culture is
Yes.
the word society. So that just means your public face,
Yeah. Yep.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. And even your parents will think like, do you not like them that you feel like you need to move away? So it's really it
Yeah,
just
as if
sends
you're
the
not happy.
right.
You're
Yeah.
not happy?
Why aren't
So,
you happy?
yeah,
Yeah.
what do you mean?
Yeah.
So it's not atypical for, um, you know, quote unquote children, to be having a very important job in the real world terms
Hmm.
and still be living at home. It's
Oh
not
yeah.
considered abnormal, okay?
No, that is the
So
norm.
exactly. So I think that is something that needed to be said, and also I feel like, we should probably make it understood that families of a certain level of wealth, so that's why we're touching upon the money issue in joint families.
Hmm.
Families of wealth have a little more fluidity in these terms. They tend to, they have a little more, how shall we say? They kind of break some of the rules, if you will, a little more. Wouldn't you say so?
Yeah,
I
I
mean, in
guess
terms of the structure, I'm not talking about like rules, but I think they have a
right.
little more fluidity, um, in in uh, in families that, have several properties, for example,
Hmm.
a family of means. Anyway, so back to the money, in joint families.
Yeah, about the wealth and the money
Mhm.
aspect, it's also like if you have a certain amount of wealth, you also want to be modern and progressive, whatever that might mean to those
Right.
people. So you
Liberal.
want liberal, yes. So you want to be open to ideas like have the kids live away from you, even though that's not what the society does. And funnily enough, that might also be accepted by the society because you have means. So
Right.
there's sort of like kind of a double standard there, but that is kind of accepted now.
Right. So in a joint family, who's in charge of the money?
Typically, the male head, the patriarch.
Right. So how are decisions made when it comes to who gets what in terms of daily expenses, or let's say clothing, which is a joint family cost? So
Hmm.
even if the father is in charge of the money, or the patriarch, not necessarily father, but the patriarch, whoever that should be,
Yeah,
whoever that is,
yeah,
I think it's not totally a known thing that there's a joint purse in many cases.
yes. Yeah. So, like, the different families may decide that they'll contribute equally to the joint purse. It might be unequal, like if there's a big disparity in what uh, the single households, like each of the brothers or each of the sisters are making, brothers actually. Um, so yeah, that typically it's an even contribution, and the women would typically do the day-to-day expenses. So they might have like a weekly or a monthly allowance that covers all the household expenses, including clothing, like more day-to-day clothing, and they might have access to that joint purse just so that they can spend for like the entire house. But if it's like the big expenses, the once in a while expenses like buying a new car, buying a new house, something really big, then that will be something that the patriarch steps in and decides.
Yeah. I would like to say that it can get very complicated. I
Yeah.
once had a friend that was in a joint family, and one person in the family wanted a new pair of sunglasses that were quite expensive.
Hmm.
And what ended up happening is the patriarch got everyone new pair of glasses for the same amount of
Ooh.
money, and used the fact that they were a joint family to negotiate with the vendor, with the sales
Oh.
person, and say, "We want, 12 of these. What
Hmm.
price are you gonna give them at?" So there's also an economic advantage, not just in the obvious sense,
Yeah.
that, people are pooling their resources, but they also use the number of family members to kind of get discounts on
Yeah.
items,
That's
saying, "We can
smart.
buy this many."
Yeah.
So I'm just trying to give a picture, um, n just to have that much more insight into this case.
Yeah. We do love a good bargain. That's true. So,
Well,
but
I
no.
mean, there are times when joint families, someone in the family may wish to separate, and that becomes
Yes.
completely complicated.
Yep. Absolutely. That's a big one. That
Not
I
just
mean,
emotionally, but also financially, there can be a big, um, you know, consequence for the
yeah.
rest of the members of the family. And for anyone who wants to hear this story, I actually got in the middle of trying to help a family negotiate cooking responsibilities, because
Ooh.
there was a desire to have 2 kitchens, because the women in the family were not feeling like they were getting a chance to show off their cooking skills, because it
Uh,
was down to 1 kitchen. So it can get really complicated.
for sure. For sure. And it can be complex enough where if suppose there's four brothers and one of them wants to split and live separately, the three can put enough pressure, especially if their father is alive, they can put enough pressure to not have the fourth one move out and he will have to stay. So
Right. Which
it's
can
like
make a wife of the brother very miserable if
miserable.
she's looking to move out.
Yeah.
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 So, another part of this is that, I remember one joint family that I knew, they decided that they were gonna build a whole building for the family. So they took
Mhm.
residents up elsewhere in flats,
Mhm.
rentals, apartments, and stayed there while this building was being constructed for them, and this was in the middle of Car, by the way,
Oh wow.
which is a part of Mumbai, everyone. And, that went on for a couple years. They were builders themselves, so they sort of bought out a building and then reconstructed the building, and they lived on several floors, and then they rented out the other floors, which was, of course, a great economic advantage to them. So they were getting rent from the other flats in the building, and they occupied like 4 or 5 floors.
Oh, wow. Okay. Nice.
Yeah, yes. And so that's just to try to give a understanding as to some of the dynamics that can happen.
Yeah.
Um, the other thing I wanted to talk a little bit about, and do stop me if you had more to say on that.
Sure.
I was thinking very much about some of the other things about Indian culture that play a part in this case. I think one of the other things is that it it is very, what's the word? It's very common for people to uh, locate or orientate themselves to other people that they meet by people's names, their surnames. Surnames in India can tell you a lot about a person even if you've not met them. Shall we talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Yep.
So, there are some surnames which can indicate where a family might be originally from,
Yes.
correct?
Yep. Absolutely. Yeah.
Um,
There's some surnames that are unique to the north, some that are unique to the south, and then like region wise, you can place the person typically uh, based on their surname.
and the other thing about names is that some of the names also tell you sort of the caste,
Yes.
correct?
Yep.
Okay, so
Yeah.
I think a lot of people would not really understand caste. I think there's a lot of stereotypes about caste. You think you can help us with a little background?
Yeah. It's like a hierarchy of people. So like you have the upper caste and the lower caste, and based on whatever caste you belong to, it would decide what jobs you would do, how you would live your life, how much money you had, etc., etc. So someone who's like of the highest caste, like a Brahmin, would be somebody who you'll see doing like the more pious work, uh, living like they're working in like temples. They have like these positions of authority where they're respected a certain way, they're listened to a certain way, they have like a certain standing in society, and they would have like they would be pure, they would be considered pure. And then you have like other people in the middle, and then you have the lowest caste where it would be like people who sweep the streets, who are doing the more, I don't know what word to use for that, but like yeah, like sweeping the streets, cleaning,
Menial jobs,
menial
yeah,
jobs. Yeah. So based
right.
on your caste, you would be slot into what kind of work you would do and what kind of standard of living you would have.
So how do you think caste operates today?
I think it's not as big as it used to be, which
Right.
is a relief in a lot of ways. It might come up, so like it might come up in certain contexts where it's given a lot of weightage. So like let's say if you're looking at an arranged marriage scenario where you're set up to marry into a certain household, like you're basically, there's a matchmaking thing that happens, where the guy where the girl is introduced to a guy and to see if they can get married and stuff. That's where caste could play a big role. So like let's say if it's a Brahmin girl, her parents might prefer that she marry a Brahmin boy. So again, it depends on whether uh, the parents are more liberal, they are more modernized, or they have traditional values. But I think otherwise caste is not such a big deal anymore.
Yeah, I mean, that was my experience, and over time, it was it really was apparent that there was a massive shift happening. Even
Mm.
if I think about, like, BPOs, basically call centers, they kind of revolutionized. I mean, this is a theory I'm throwing out, but when those became very big to have call centers in India,
Hmm.
it gave money to a class of society that did not have those opportunities previously.
Yep. So true.
So
So
it
true.
it it changed a lot of things. It empowered a whole section of society that
Hmm.
ordinarily wouldn't have those opportunities.
Yeah, that's really true because I think there was also a time that they weren't allowed to move forward and have more wealth because it didn't line up with the caste that they belong to.
Right.
But now we've like moved past that, and anybody can amass wealth if they work hard and such and such.
Absolutely. I mean, I saw it in front of my eyes how, like a huge shift. It was like, an
Mm.
economic revolution, and it had far-reaching impact that is still going on today, obviously. So
Yeah.
I think it's just a little helpful to understand that everybody's name says
Yes.
something about them,
Yeah.
and I'm gonna get into that, with you, some questions I have for you later, some
Sure.
some topics. Now there's some other elements to this case that I feel like it's kind of important to understand.
Okay.
Um, police. Now this is a whole
Mhm.
topic that anybody sitting in Mumbai would have a lot to say about.
Yeah.
Um, I think that if you're not really understanding how, like, the police/justice system works in India, and some people would say not work,
Yep.
doesn't work,
Yes.
um, that it's a little difficult to understand what's actually going on here. So I think, like, a little bit of information about the police themselves, I guess particularly, about Mumbaikar police, but
Hmm.
there's a little bit of there's a few parts of this case that I think would be, like, very confusing.
Yeah.
So let's talk about how people in India, or particularly Mumbai, view
Yeah.
the police. What is their role in society? What is the daily experience?
Uh, Mainly it's, well, trying to think about how to say this the right way, but like
Yeah,
our
sorry to put you
interaction.
on the spot. I mean, if you want me to take the heat, I'll put it on.
No, it's fine. It's only fair. Uh, my Okay, we're not scared of the cops. Let me put it that way, very bluntly. We're not that scared of cops. Like the way I would be scared of cops here is not the
Right,
same
yeah,
way that it would translate back home.
right,
Um, our main interactions are when it comes to any kind of traffic violations. So I haven't driven in India in a while. Like every time I go back home, I always have somebody driving with me.
right,
But my experience a few years back was that if there is a traffic violation, you can basically pay the cop off and not have any tickets. Getting a traffic violation, getting ticketed for a traffic violation, was the anomaly, not the norm. It
right,
it would
absolutely,
have
yeah,
Yeah, you would have to do something really egregious, and you could still bribe the cop. But if suppose you like if egos start to play a role and you think that you didn't do anything wrong, you start arguing with the cop, that would be a situation where you could get a ticket. Otherwise, you could basically get away with almost anything with a traffic violation. Now I hear, but let me also say this. Now I hear that it's changing. Everything is becoming more electronic, and then if you do violate any traffic rules, you do get ticketed or you do have to pay your fine. Um,
I have to pause.
sure.
Sneha,
Okay, we're back.
yeah, we're back. We got interrupted because the Chad Daybell verdict came in. So we took a few minutes to kind of process that together.
Hmm.
So we were somewhere in mid-sentence, but I know we were talking about the police. And
Yes.
so, why don't you pick up?
Mm.
I think you had another point to make, and then I was gonna share some things. Go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think I talked about like all the traffic violations and general day-to-day police interactions. But
Yes.
one other thing um, that is relevant with the whole cops issue is power and connections. If you're someone who has connections higher up in the police department or the crime branch or just like law enforcement agencies, it um, it does help a lot. I I don't feel comfortable in saying that you can just basically get away with anything, but you can tip the scales in your favor quite a bit. It just muddies the waters a lot more if you know somebody who can like help you out. Um, And it can definitely, yeah, tip the scales in your favor.
Yeah, I mean, I think we should make it clear that no one wants to go to a police station. It's
Yes.
one thing to have interactions with police officers on the street,
Yes.
and for those who've never been to India or Mumbai particularly or specifically, I would wanna say that it is very common to see police officers every day as you go about your business.
Yep.
They're definitely a strong street presence.
Mm-hmm.
It is very easy to find a police officer somewhere around.
Yes.
They do a lot of community policing.
Mm-hmm.
So that is an element that I think in other parts of the world, yeah, you see police officers, but they're on the street. Like they are walking around.
Yes.
And everybody knows where the local police station is.
Yep.
It's part of the way you navigate
Mhm.
everyday life in Mumbai.
Yes.
And but no one wants to go to a police station.
So true.
And the reason why we would be saying that is because if you're going there, it means that there's something happening in which, there's gonna be all kinds of elements in play that, most people in life want to avoid. I'm, like,
Yeah.
trying to figure out how to
Yeah.
really explain that.
I get you.
There's a lot of everyday kind of matters that you may need police authorization for
Mhm.
that, we don't necessarily think of in other countries. Um, you need, like, clearances for different things.
Mhm.
Um,
Passport. Passports. or whatever.
passport, it could like, for me, I would have to register with the police so
Yeah.
that they know that there's a foreign person, living at a particular residence. There's all kinds of different activities that you may be doing at a police station
Yeah.
that don't ordinarily happen in other parts of the world. So I think it's a really important thing. Overall, police are considered to be what you want to avoid. And that doesn't mean that you're doing anything wrong. You just
Yeah.
avoid it. And
Yeah.
I think it's kind of it's very different, you
Yeah.
know. So the other thing is what you touched upon is that people do have their connections.
Mhm.
And I think that's an important point for this case.
Yeah.
People do have relationships with police officers
Yeah.
that are unique.
Mhm.
So I think too, we probably should mention what an FIR is.
Mhm.
And that plays a big role here. So would you like to talk about that?
Sure. It's uh it's basically a first information report, FIR. It's when you say there's a crime that you witnessed or you experienced, you go to the police station, you speak to a police officer, and you start telling them what happened. They should make a report of what you're telling them, which is the first information report. It's the first thing that the cop hears from the person who's reporting the crime. So it's the first report that is made based on the crime that is being reported.
So in America, that would be like filing a complaint of
Yes.
some sort with the police.
Yes.
But I want to make it clear that police in India typically are not too quick to make out an FIR. They, in certain circumstances, they actually even try to convince you not to file a report.
Yeah, I think it's also when you have the FIR that is lodged with the police, it means that they have to investigate, take action, and follow that through. Basically, investigate, and hopefully close the case. If they don't want to do that for whatever reason, they'll try to convince you to not make the FIR so that they don't have to follow through on it.
Right. And I think this comes into play when, particularly with Rahul, who
Mhm.
is having an issue according to him, about filing an FIR. So I want to make it understood that,
Mhm.
you can go in there with a complaint does not mean that they're going to file a report.
Right. Yeah. It can, I mean, it can also be pretty blatant where if they refuse to do
Yes.
that, there
Yes.
isn't much recourse that somebody would have, because you would have to go to the police department of the jurisdiction, of the relevant jurisdiction. So, like, where the crime occurred or where you live, but typically where the crime occurred. If they don't take the FIR, then you're basically left with no recourse.
Right. And sometimes you get stuck between two police stations' jurisdictions,
Yes.
and neither of them, they'll push you from one jurisdiction back to the other.
Yep. Yep.
So that also happens. Um, and I think it's also important to note that if FIRs are filed, like hundreds of them every day.
Mm-hmm.
Mumbai is a huge city.
Yeah.
It's over 23 million, I think, at
Mm-hmm.
last count. If you can just imagine how many people come into the station wanting to file a complaint. There's all kinds of things that police, all kinds of situations that police get involved in. They could be a domestic dispute. They could be a claim that a neighbor, stole a bike. I
Yeah.
mean, it can get pretty challenging for them
Mm-hmm.
to have to navigate all these complaints. And
Right.
so, unless it has great, merit to it, they don't really like to do it.
Yeah.
So there, just to give a more fair
Oh, yeah.
presentation, that
Yes.
it's a very difficult thing also because they're faced with, family fights,
Yeah.
all kinds of stuff. There are people who make false complaints.
Yes.
That happens all the time. Um, they're kind of in an unenviable position.
Yeah.
So now there's also this thing that comes up in this case where there's the difference between the police and the CBI.
Mm-hmm.
So CBI is
So CBI is the Central Bureau of Investigation.
right. And so what is really the difference between these two bodies?
So I think of the CBI as like the FBI,
Right.
with like teeth and investigative power over the entire country,
Right.
versus like police departments that are like jurisdiction specific and local agencies.
Right. So it's like kicking it up a level, right?
Yes.
Right. So in this case, both both bodies become involved.
Yes.
Right. So I think that that's kind of a view to the attitudes and how policing is done, or how Indians think or Mumbaikars think about police.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Um,
actually, I just want to say, like, when some if a matter goes to the CBI, that means it's pretty serious. Just like how it happens here with the FBI. It's like,
right,
we need help.
right,
We need someone with more resources who can actually figure this out for us. So that's when I would say, like, the matter is taken a lot more seriously.
right. And there's a lot of perception, I think, that because um, of like the traffic violations you brought up, pay
Mhm.
100 rupees or whatever, get rid
Yeah.
of the cop. Um, this tends to really create a perception of the police as a corrupt force.
Yeah.
So there is that too, and that plays itself out in this case as well.
Yes.
It's a complicated relationship
Hmm.
between the citizens and the police force.
Yeah.
Um, the thing is that everybody knows that this is what happens. It is not unknown to the leadership that these traffic violations and these fines are being taken and
Right.
bribes along with it. It's kind of like considered to be almost, while not officially condoned,
Yeah.
unofficially understood.
Yes.
So I think it's important to understand that one of the attitudes that people who may find themselves in trouble they have is that they will not feel that there's a ethical violation
Mm-hmm.
with actually giving some money to the police to make things go away.
Yeah.
There's
Yeah.
there's also the opposite, which is like if you want to get somebody in trouble,
Mm-hmm.
money may be given to kind of create trouble for
Yes.
someone.
Yep.
So, these are not things that are happy to say, but there's a
Yeah.
certain kind of reality to them that I think is important to.
Acknowledge.
Um, Sorry, we also got interrupted because in the Chad Gable case, they've come back for sentencing. So sorry
Yeah.
about that.
Yeah.
All right. So that's the police.
Yes.
All right. So another thing I thought that was really important to kind of understand this case is a few more things. One of them is breakups.
Mm-hmm.
Now, getting engaged in India is a fairly serious business.
Yes.
Would you like to talk about that a little bit? Because, we do have Sheena and Rahul getting engaged.
Yeah.
So there are different levels to this. And I thought we should talk about relationship breakups in, typical cultural Indian life.
Yeah. Sure. Um,
And
yeah.
along with that, I should say, marriage, relationships,
Yeah.
to try to understand how this all goes.
Yeah. So this is my understanding, maybe a um, little obsolete because I've been here for a while. But basically, if you're seeing somebody, you go once you've agreed, like once two people have agreed that they're seeing each other, you're in a relationship. There's no dating phase as such. Now that's gradually changing, but if two people are interested in each other, they've decided that they want to be together, they're in a relationship and it's exclusive. The norm is that the relationship would move to the next level unless something drastic happens, like if like one of them cheated, or like parents are just absolutely opposed and they don't want the couple to get married. Barring those situations, the couple will go ahead and get married. So that is the trajectory that you're on once you've decided to be with somebody. You will typically get married. Now, a lot of that is changing, it's becoming more westernized, but that is by and large how relationships work. So if you are engaged with somebody like how Sheena and Rahul were, you typically would get married unless
Right.
something really drastic happened, which did in this case. But you're basically on the track to get married. So relationships are serious.
Exactly. And so a lot of times there is an engagement formality. It really
Yes.
depends on what religion you are a member of. Um, but it's very typical for people to have a formal ceremony where they're engaged, where they invite friends and family.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a well-known thing. And at that point, that is considered done.
Yes.
It's not that engagement breakups don't happen.
Right.
It's just it was very rare.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Now I don't know. Again, it's like some things have changed,
Right.
but where people are more willing to say, actually, I don't think this is going to work.
Yeah.
Um, which in the past would bring dishonor to your family.
Yes.
Um, I mean, not that that is still not present in, particularly in rural India.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but it is important to understand because we have a breakup in this case,
Yeah.
or a seeming breakup, or a potential breakup, however you want to put that. Um, but I think it's important to understand that multiple marriages
Mm-hmm.
also
I did want to
unusual.
speak to that. Yes. Yeah.
That's unusual.
Yeah.
Um, in this case, we have multiple marriages, which is particularly for this number. You might have one broken marriage, but to have several is unusual.
Yes.
Living in together is not unheard of in a metro, meaning like a major city.
Yeah.
But it is very rare.
Yes.
Um, it is very rare.
Yes.
And
Yes.
um, breakups um, are usually very emotional events
Mm-hmm.
for the parties involved. They do happen, obviously, and
Yeah.
as in anything, any other place.
Mm-hmm.
But they carry an emotional component um, that I would say is kind of different than other places.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah,
and
because I think there's so much involvement for everybody. Like you feel like you've now caused, like you said, dishonor to your family by being tainted almost. That you have a relationship that didn't work out.
right, and it's also that when you're dating a boy or a girl, you're dating their entire family.
Mm-hmm.
And we're not just talking brothers and sisters and parents. We're talking cousins,
Yep.
second cousins,
Yeah.
aunts and uncles. I mean, it's like everybody is involved.
Yeah.
So, in that, because of that, it is not unusual to have people having relationships that no one knows about.
Yes.
So that's an important part of this case as well. It's like who knows that there's a relationship happening.
Yeah.
It's not uncommon for young couples to choose not to tell a lot of people or to keep it under wraps because the weight of that in terms of the family dynamic is great.
So true.
So it's really it's not uncommon at all that even people who are close to you may not know that you're dating
Yes.
someone. So there's a lot of what could be considered secretiveness. Some would say privacy because it's very difficult. You don't want to hurt people.
Yeah.
Um, so that's a really key thing to know.
Yeah. And I do want to say something. You brought that up, which is important. Divorce is not, we're now moving towards it as a country, but it's usually looked down upon. It's not an option. So once you're married for life. And even divorce that you do see is in the metropolitan cities, not so much in rural areas. So to have a person like Indrani who's had three husbands, that's why she uses some of the labels that she does for herself. Like that's how people view her in society, because it's very atypical for someone to have more than two husbands. More than one husband is also atypical, but more than two is kind of pushing
Right.
it.
Like, your outer limits on that. And
Yes.
and there is a stigma that's attached to divorce, but
Mm-hmm.
also a female who gets divorced
Mm-hmm.
carries a greater burden of
Yes.
stigma than a male. And
Absolutely.
in some castes, like I'm thinking of in Maharashtra, if you're more in the rural areas, there are
Mhm.
castes which, if your husband decides to depart from you, you
Mhm.
may never remarry.
Yes.
So that's another very important fact here that you
Yeah.
are not permitted to remarry and keep a good name.
Yes.
It doesn't matter how old you are.
Yeah.
But
So true.
that great burden does not necessarily weigh on the male.
No. Yeah, it's not the same.
So this is part of the psychology of this case,
Yeah.
and some of the maybe help illuminate some of the choices or even reactions to some of the events in this case. Um, the other thing is that particularly there are issues about purity in the culture,
Mm-hmm.
premarital sex,
Yes.
all of these things are in play.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Big time.
right. Now, I also want to say that in breakups, if there's a divorce or if there's a separation, now it's not uncommon for two people to remain married their whole lives, but maybe even live separately.
Yes.
Or live separately even if they're living in the same house.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, the marriage is defunct,
Yep.
but they continue for the sake of family, honor, and
Yeah.
just, everyday practicality to remain married
Yes.
formally. And I do think a really important part of this story is the idea of presenting a daughter as a sister. I have to say that this is also not as uncommon as one might imagine.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
when a family, in fact, I knew somebody
Mm-hmm.
personally who had a son whose first marriage did not work out.
Mm-hmm.
And what had happened was her parents adopted the child, her son,
Oh,
and then insisted that everybody around them refer to the child as the brother of the mother.
that gives me Ted Bundy vibes.
Yeah, I mean, it's very like you visit a friend's house. This was a friend of a friend. One day you're there and it's like he's calling her mother. The next day you go there, he's calling her Dee Dee, which means sister.
Ooh, oh, you saw that happen, like the
Mhm.
transition happen.
Yes.
Wow.
So, and this is part of the problem with the purity culture is that if there is a, a marriage that people want to suddenly pretend like it didn't happen, or if there's like an out of wedlock child,
Yes.
kinds of situations where and can be part of the norm.
Yep. Yeah.
So I think that's also really important to understand that, it's not like this doesn't and didn't happen in multiple families. I wouldn't want it to seem like, you know, Indrani's choices were absolutely an outlier.
Yeah. True. It's an
Um,
it,
yeah,
yeah. And I was just gonna say that these things are so obvious to me that they don't strike me because I grew up in that culture. So when you say
mhm.
it like this, it makes sense. I do agree with you that it's not common, but it's also not uncommon. Like I didn't know anybody who had a child outside of their marriage or before their marriage because they had premarital sex, but it's also not hard to imagine that they would.
Right,
It's only when you
right,
say it do I see both sides of the coin.
right. And um, it's very difficult for people to wrap their head around this. Um,
Oh.
for some people, that is just something that they never heard of.
Mm.
It did happen in the United States at a certain time, um, though I think it was probably, like I would say, in like 40s. I mean, on back like forever, but
Mm.
it's not like it never didn't. I mean, it's like it's happened here. It's
Right.
happened everywhere. But
Right.
I think in India, it's a little more common
Mm-hmm.
or a little less uncommon, however you want to put that. And that
Right.
is not to say anything bad about India. I just think
Right.
it's important that if we're going to have a discussion about this case, we need to be real and
Right.
give a clear picture so
Yes.
that it doesn't get tilted in a direction.
Yes. Agreed.
Um, the other thing I thought was important to kind of bring up and talk to you about was the relationship between the United Kingdom and India, because obviously Rahul is someone who, kind of grew up in the UK,
Mm-hmm.
and this family has homes there,
Mm-hmm.
and I think Vidya was talking about being in London and things like
Yeah.
that. This also does play into this case. At least I think so.
Oh.
Well, maybe then I should push it off. So I think there's a complicated relationship between the British, as they would be called, even for when you're in India. They're frequently referred to the British. Obviously, uh, you know, India gained independence from Britain.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Queen Victoria was the Empress of India, right?
Yeah.
And it wasn't until what was it, 1948 or
7.
9? What?
47 is when we gained it.
47, thank you.
Yeah.
That and the reason why I'm bringing this up is because even though there is like this you know being proud of having gained independence,
Mm-hmm.
National pride. There's also this funny thing about if your kids are able to go to school, we'll send them to the UK.
Yeah.
It's a sign of success or prosperity or achievement,
Yeah. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it's
Sorry.
complicated, right? Go ahead.
Yeah, it's that's exactly it. It's like India used to be a British colony, and after we got our freedom, if we can colonize ourselves as individuals in the UK, it means like we've made it in one sense. If we can afford those high prices in the UK, we can own houses there, we can get our kids married there or go to school there. Because it's so expensive, we feel like it's a sense of achievement more than maybe anywhere else in the world, just because we've been a British colony. So there's a lot of sense of pride affiliated with having any piece of property or something big that you did in the UK.
Yes. And I also think there's a thing about there's quite a lot to say about Indians who grow up in the UK and what that means. There's kind of an attitude among some that they're somehow better.
Yeah.
So that I think is so when Rahul kind of gives up being in England to come back to India,
Hmm.
there's some elements there that I think work into this case. That's my personal opinion. What do you think? Are we ready to do episode 2?
Yes, let's do it.
Okay. All right. Let's do it.